Russia has, as we've noticed, become a very dangerous place for Moscow's own business elite. You know, the death toll there of business leaders and politically affiliated characters who've moved into business, who've fallen from balconies, who've been found drowned in their baths, that surpassed 78 earlier on this year since the start of the Ukraine war.
We had breaking news this morning that a Russian general had been killed in an explosion in Moscow. Russia's investigative committee say Lieutenant General Fanil Sarvarov died when a device detonated beneath his car. Nina Dos Santos is a former Europe editor of CNN and host of the podcast Control Alt Deceit. Tell us more about what happened this morning, Nina. What are the latest details?
Good morning, Guto. Well, there are very scant details. According to the head of Russia's investigative committee, as you pointed out, this 56-year-old veteran, a very senior member of the Russian military, a general indeed, appears to have died in a car bomb in South Moscow. And now, remember, what's interesting about this is that there was actually another senior member of the Russian military that died in a car bomb in December of 2024 as well. And that eventually was linked to the Ukrainian services. One of the sort of guerrilla tactics, if you like, hitting right at this important time of year. So far, we haven't had a comment or any acknowledgement that the Ukrainians may well have been involved in this, but it could potentially be one of those operations, very risky operations, that Ukraine has decided to mount deep inside Russia, deep inside the Russian capital, to target the military elite, which is it has done before, as I said before, at times like this.
Are they likely, Putin and his people to blame the Ukrainians, whatever the reality here?
That may well be the case. We've often heard narratives like that. The reality is that this is a very senior individual who will have been involved in stamping out lots of important rebellions in other breakaway republics of Russia. He was involved in the conflicts in South Ossetia and in Ingushetia 20 odd years ago, and fought in the Chechen wars. So this is somebody who has a significant history in sort of stamping out rebellions in areas that wanted to break away from Russia. And of course, remember that Vladimir Putin very much has, for a number of years, spun the narrative that he believes that Ukraine should always have remained part of sort of Russia's imperial orbit. So more details will probably emerge later on today. But the reality is that if it is indeed Ukraine, it is very, very risky to mount these types of operations. But of course, it comes at a time when the conflict remains frozen, when Vladimir Putin doesn't appear to be interested in pursuing a meaningful path to peace at the moment. And so Ukraine will sort of take its chances in some cases deep inside Russian territory with these sort of sabotage operations. I would say, though, that Russia has, as we've noticed, become a very dangerous place for Moscow's own business elite. You know, the death toll there of business leaders and politically affiliated characters who've moved into business, who've fallen from balconies, who've been found drowned in their baths, that surpassed 78 earlier on this year since the start of the Ukraine war. So there appear to be two things going on. On the one hand, as I was saying before, the Russian military can be targeted by commandos in secret operations that go from Ukraine into Moscow, but there are also some very strange things going on among the Russian political and business elite that may well be internal to Russia as well.
Nina Dos Santos, thank you very much for those fascinating insights.
Over the weekend, Russian negotiators met with the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in Florida to discuss plans to end the war in Ukraine. Kyiv and its European allies have proposed changes to the US-backed plan. The Kremlin said yesterday that these changes would not improve the likelihood of peace, which is a very polite and somewhat Russian way of saying no. We've also had a reminder, though, this morning of how far away peace appears to be, because a Russian general has been killed in a car bomb attack in Moscow. Lieutenant General Fanil Savarov, thank you very much. Lieutenant General Fanil Savarov was killed this morning, and Russian investigators suspect Ukrainian involvement. We'll get on to those peace talks in a moment. But first, let's discuss that bomb attack. Is this the sort of thing that we know the Ukrainians are doing? Car bombs in Moscow?
Well, they've done it before. They appear to have done it before. He's not the first senior Russian military guy to have been killed in this way. I mean, the details so far, all we know about it was shortly before 7 o'clock Russian time this morning, residential area south of Moscow, which is presumably where he lives, got into the car to drive off to work, fairly modest sounding Kia car, and then boom, the thing blew up. dead immediately.
Is there? I mean, this is look. The Ukraine has Western support in this war. Does it have Western support in planting car bombs in the middle of Moscow?
It's difficult to say. I mean, they have done it in the past. I've said we've had at least, I think, 3 or 4 other instances. To some extent, the Ukrainians do their own thing. And, what is the point of this? I mean, this guy was the head of the Operational Training Directorate of the General Staff. So, he was directly involved in the war, one could say. One could call him a legitimate military target. I think also the idea of striking people actually within Moscow is a good one for as far as the Ukrainian strategy is concerned, because Putin's great aim, I think, has been to kind of insulate Moscow, insulate St. Petersburg, which in Russia are the two places that really matter from the war. Yeah. And so, be it the occasional drone strike that finds its way to Moscow or an assassination like this, it's a way of sort of saying to the Muscovites, hey, this war, you're in this war. You're not just spectators watching it for a long way away. So, a double win for the Ukrainians if they did it. And so far they've been quite coy about it, as they always are.
But I mean, for the Russians, do they just blame Ukraine for this sort of thing, or do they blame us? Do they see this as being sort of NATO terrorism conducted within their borders?
I think that as the war has gone on, as far as the Russian official narrative has blurred the distinction between us and the Ukrainians. So this is just a Western assault on Russia. And, the Ukrainians are almost just our tools in our assault in Russia. And I mean, we saw this in Putin's sort of marathon annual press conference, which he gave at the end of last week, where, it's sort of part show, because it goes on for hours and hours, and it's part sort of conversations with normal people. And there are a few opportunities for journalists as well. The BBC Steve Rosenberg, their Moscow Russia editor, he asked the question about, essentially, or asked a number of questions, but essentially the main one was, is Russia going to attack anywhere else? And, the natural Putin response to that was, if you stop pressuring us, if you stop kind of attacking us. And that's, whether Putin believes that or doesn't believe that, the aim is to convince the Russian people that, since probably the 1990s, we, the West, have been aggressive towards Russia. That's their narrative. I don't believe it. Putin has convinced, I think, a large number of the Russian people to believe it.
Just finally on this attack, does this represent a significant failure by the Russians that this is even possible? Russia is an authoritarian state. It is quite heavily policed in various kind of ways. One would assume even more so now than it was many, the many years ago I used to go there. The fact that the Ukrainians can come in and launch a strike like this, that does make the Kremlin look somewhat weak, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it reminds me a little bit about that very, very dramatic attack where we saw months and months ago, where there was a truck, if I remember it correctly, and suddenly the sort
full of drones. Yeah,
the roof of the truck opened up. These drones came out and attacked a major, I can't remember, was it a military installation or an oil refinery or whatever. So the Ukrainians can do that kind of stuff. They have, to some extent, infiltrated Russian society, and it's relatively easy to do that because there were a lot of Ukrainians, and still are an awful lot of Ukrainians living in Russia. During Soviet times there was no real clear border between the two countries, and it's very easy to be an undercover Ukrainian, as it were, living in Russia.
Let's turn to those peace talks then in Florida. It looks on the surface like we're still in this position where Russia is demanding an awful lot than Ukraine is prepared to give. Is that an accurate reading of it, or is Russia just doing what it can to shoot down the talks?
Yeah, I mean, what we had in Miami was a slightly weird kind of situation. So there were 2 lots of talks going on simultaneously. There were the American talks with the Ukrainians, which were all about kind of coming up with a kind of a joint plan, because, rolling back a bit, there was a sort of a 28-point plan that was announced last month, and then it turned into a 20-point plan. There's been much toing and throwing, sort of within the Western camp. Then simultaneously, you have the Russian talks with the Americans. But the Russians have not met the Ukrainians. So these 2 kind of processes going on. And, everyone is very, very positive about it. I mean, I think everyone is trying to appease Donald Trump, and Donald Trump likes positivity. So you have, the Russians have to say, this is very constructive, productive and constructive is the term. The Ukrainians also say this is productive and constructive. But there are, two major stumbling blocks. The first one, I think, is that the Russians want more land than they've got already. It's that, they're not happy just to freeze the sort of the battle lines. They want a chunk of Donetsk, the sort of region in the east, which they don't have already, which is completely impossible for the Ukrainians, both for strategic reasons and for political reasons. And the second one is the whole question of security guarantees. What if the Russians do a peace deal and then pause for a bit, get their act together and attack again? Which is, again, can you find a compromise that will be sufficiently tough for the Ukrainians, but not so tough that it upsets the Russians?
Is Europe playing any meaningful role here? I mean, because one can never quite, certainly I can never quite figure out whether Europe is really performing a valuable role in defending Ukraine from the compromises that America is trying to persuade Ukraine to make, or whether Europe is really just there for its own prestige to make sure it doesn't look and feel irrelevant.
Yeah, I think the latter maybe is a little bit cynical. I mean, they are the Europeans are there because they're sort of arguing on behalf of the Ukrainians to the Americans. So they're kind of arguing, they're sort of defending the Ukrainians. Yeah. And so they're playing that role, I think, in trying to persuade the Americans. And also, we shouldn't forget that last week we had this very important decision. It was a compromise at the Marathon Summit in Brussels, where a 90 billion euro, so more than 80 billion pound loan, interest-free loan, not bad, was agreed for the Ukrainians. It was sort of a compromise because initially the discussion was about the Russian assets that have been held. So they're there. But I think, the weird thing, if one sort of steps back a little and sort of thinks of how things have changed since the times of Biden. I mean, in when Biden was president, the West was sort of a solid unit, America, Europe, Ukrainians, against the Russians. Under Trump, America is somehow putting itself in the middle, despite the fact it's obviously in NATO, and one would think it's nominally still a Ukrainian ally. So therefore you have this dual track kind of process of both having to find an agreement among America, Europe and Ukraine on one side, and then even once that's agreed, putting it to the Russians.
So Zelensky has said that Ukraine would be in favour of three-way talks with Russia and the US if they come up with more prisoner exchanges, and that could sort of pave the way for an actual meeting of national leaders. How important would it be for that to happen? How likely is it that happens?
I mean, you can't get an agreement until the two leaders, until Zelensky and Putin have sat down together. I mean, this kind of formula of having parallel talks. I mean, I think in the past it's been used in the Middle East. I mean, I'm no expert on the Middle East, but it's not so weird. But you have to make sufficient progress with that, the sort of the two parallel channels, before you bring them together. But I would say that's quite a long way down the line. I mean, we don't expect anything much more to happen, I think, until well after Christmas.
So in the next year then, in 2026, and briefly, I'm afraid, how likely is it that we have some kind of, if not a solution, then a freezing of the conflict, a cessation of hostilities, in one way or another?
I think it's fairly likely, but I wouldn't bet on it.
And I mean, what do you think? Do you think is a freezing more likely than a peace? I mean, is peace for the birds?
I think peace is very difficult because you also then get into the question of recognition of territory. Is it formal recognition? Is it just de facto recognition? A huge gulf between two of those. I mean, I think ultimately the Russians will have to accept that, they get to keep what they've got, but they can't get extra stuff because that is just impossible for the Ukrainians.
Peter Conradi, Europe editor for the Sunday Times. Thanks very much indeed. Great to have you here.